Alright, this video will cover two administrations, Dwight D. Eisenhower and JFK, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. We'll start with Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dwight D. Eisenhower will serve two terms in the 1950s. There's great confidence that Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had been Supreme Allied Commander of Forces on D-Day, helping to liberate Western Europe from the Nazis, would be a strong leader for the United States in continuing its policy of containing communism. Under his policies of containment, he had a new look for policy of containing communism. And this was based on the idea of massive retaliation. What this meant was essentially, instead of spending money on traditional forces, having troops in Korea and troops in Europe and troops in all over the world trying to put out what were called brush fire wars to contain communism, instead we would put most of our money on missile defense security and bombs, and essentially threaten the Soviet Union. If they acted aggressively, we would threaten them with massive retaliation. And we hope that we would never have to use this technology, but simply having it would keep the Soviets and keep the communists in check. So that's the theory behind containment during the Eisenhower years. It does lead to an escalation of the arms race into the 1950s, but it does reduce the amount of spending that we were doing on traditional military. By the time you get to the 1960s, John Fitzgerald Kennedy had been elected. He represented a new generation of leadership during the Cold War, a younger generation. He asked in his inaugural address that young people ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. So it was a period of service in the name of liberty and democracy. The second point that you need to be familiar with from his inaugural address is that the United States would pay any price, bear any burden, we would meet any hardship, we would support any friend, oppose any foe in order to assure the success of liberty. And of course this is sort of a fancy way of saying that this young President Kennedy would continue the policy of containment, that our goal was to support liberty wherever it was in trouble, and we would continue to do that during his administration. One of his more famous speeches in the name of liberty and inspiration is his West Berlin speech. In 1961, the Soviet Union has a new leader, Nikita Khrushchev. Stalin is dead by this point, and Nikita Khrushchev orders the building of the Berlin Wall in Berlin, Germany. And this is really an act of oppression to try to keep the East Berliners from fleeing to the democratic West Berlin. And so John Fitzgerald Kennedy will travel to West Berlin and give his famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech to say, I am one of you, I am a Berliner, I'm standing on the side of freedom. And he'll say in this speech that, of course, freedom and democracy doesn't have to build walls to keep people in, that people want to be free. So this becomes a sort of iconic speech in the name of freedom for Kennedy during the Cold War. The other key point that you need to associate with the Kennedy years is its association with the Civil Rights Movement. After World War II in the 50s and the 60s, African Americans will demand to be treated as equal citizens. And of course this made sense in the context of the Cold War, when we're trying to prove that freedom and democracy is the best. If we don't have true freedom, true equality in the United States, it becomes a real issue trying to sell that to other people. So we needed to make our society truly equal during the Cold War. So remember, the NAACP, started by W.E.B. Du Bois, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, will form a legal defense team to try to sue in court for greater freedom and greater civil rights. The court case that you need to associate primarily with segregation and inequality was Plessy. Plessy versus Ferguson, way back in 1896, the Supreme Court had basically declared that segregated facilities did not violate one's 14th Amendment rights to citizenship and equal protection of the law. Because if you had a place to go to school, or a place to drink water, or a place to wait, then you technically, the court had said back then, had been provided those facilities, so you were being treated the same as everyone else. The problem, of course, with the whole Jim Crow era, the whole segregation period, is that these facilities are not equal at all. They're quite unequal. And of course, the glaring example is in the school systems. Black schools were tar-papered shacks versus the nice quality schools that white students had. So this becomes the case that really draws the attention by the 50s regarding the school system. In Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, the NAACP will sue for the overturning of segregation in the public school systems. The NAACP attorney who will lead in this case is Thurgood Marshall. This is a picture of him. But there's also a Virginia case out of Farmville, Virginia. This is a picture of the monument in Richmond, Virginia to the students, including Barbara Johns, who led a student walkout at her school to protest the deplorable conditions of the black schools in Virginia. And so Oliver Hill becomes the NAACP attorney in the Virginia case. And they're successful at proving that segregation as far as schools were not equal at all, and of course the High Court will demand that segregation in public schools end. So 1954, the Brown decision will overturn Plessy. The South, in reaction, will not, with all deliberate speed, follow the court order to desegregate. One of the more famous examples comes out of Little Rock, Arkansas, as non-black students called the Little Rock Nine will attempt to attend an all-white high school, Little Rock Central High School. And of course, they're met with a white angry mob blocking their entrance. And so ultimately Eisenhower in the 50s had to call in the troops to escort the students to school. So there is quite resistance after the Brown decision to desegregation. Virginia is no different. Virginia, in its response to the Brown decision, instituted a policy known as massive resistance. Massive resistance is where schools were closed, public schools closed, rather than allow desegregation, allowing black students and white students to attend the same schools. Of course, these students are showing, of course, their frustration having lost years of their education. And down here it says, well, let's tell the Russians about this. So in the context of the Cold War, it's not good for the United States to continue policies of inequality, but yet there is this resistance to change in the South. As public schools closed, people who could afford to send their kids to private schools did in order to avoid integration. Prosperous white families would leave urban school districts rather than have their students go to integrated schools. And so there is a great sort of test in the South to federalism, the supremacy of this federal court order for some time. The real turning point in terms of thoughts on the need for some change for many is the 1963 March on Washington. In 1963, with all the problems and violence and inequalities, many people, both black and white, supported improvements in civil rights. And this march was nonviolent. This was a mass protest by both black and white citizens to support further civil rights legislation to overturn some of the inequalities in the country. And of course, the keynote speaker is the spearhead of the modern civil rights movement, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who had always advocated the power of nonviolent protest. And at that day, on the March on Washington in 1963, he'll deliver his most famous speech, the I Have a Dream speech. This, of course, is given from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial Lincoln, of course, associated with the Civil War, the end of slavery, and the Civil War having been a new birth of freedom. And then as of 1963, Dr. King talks about his dream for the country to finally live up to its creed that all men are created equal. So this becomes an important moment in the period of the Cold War and the fight for civil rights. Kennedy will not survive. He will be assassinated, we'll be learning in a second, to sign some of this modern civil rights legislation, but he did support civil rights change. Point number 3 for the Kennedy years has to do with the space program, NASA. NASA is created to catch up to the Soviets in the space race. Sputnik had been a Soviet satellite, and it was orbiting Earth, and the United States needed to catch up and surpass the Soviets. So Kennedy will increase his pledge of support for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and he will pledge to send a man to the moon by the end of the decade. These are some of the names associated with the space race that you need to know. John Glenn, who's here, was the first American to orbit the Earth. This is the famous Neil Armstrong, who does become the first man to walk on the moon. And then Sally Ride in the 80s becomes the first American woman in space. As far as quotes, quite famous, when Neil Armstrong walks on the surface of the moon, he says, "This is one small step for man, but it's one giant leap for mankind." So Kennedy will not see Neil Armstrong, and he will not see the first man walk on the moon, but Kennedy did support this program and some advancements in the 60s in the space race. These are some other things I won't read to you, but that you need to see your SOL packet on. Over time, over the past 3 decades, there's been lots of improvement in technology and media. This, you live it. Communications, robotics, even in surgery. Much of the time surgery is done through robotic surgery. Communication devices, cell phones that you all have. These are all things that have made the connectivity between urban and rural areas much more quick. Global access to information, quick access. In terms of space exploration into the modern era, the space shuttle, which took men and women into space. The Mars rover is a robot that collected data on Mars. The Voyager missions went to the outer planets, and then of course the Hubble telescope, which saw some of the outer galaxies and the birth of stars and death of stars. So just be aware some of the names and some of the programs that are a legacy of the space race from the Cold War era. Back to Kennedy, in the 60s, one of the foes that he faced happened to be Fidel Castro. Castro came to power in 1959, just before Kennedy took office, and essentially that became a real concern because Castro was communist, and Cuba is really near Florida and the United States. And of course, Castro, being communist, had ties to Nikita Khrushchev and the Soviet Union. So in 1961, there was an effort to get rid of Castro. It ended up being a failed attempt. This was called the Bay of Pigs, or the invasion site. This is the Bay of Pigs. And the Cuban exiles that had been trained by the CIA to invade and overthrow Fidel Castro, many of them were captured and paraded before the media as an example of U.S. aggression. So the Bay of Pigs, not a good situation for the United States, and Castro remained in power. Following that, the height of the Cold War tension was also in Cuba. In 1962, the Soviet Union placed missiles in Cuba, here against Cuba, and these missiles, intermediate range, medium range ballistic missiles, were pointed at the United States. And these are, of course, showing you the range. The only city that really was out of range in the United States was Seattle. But every American city was under the target of these missile systems. So JFK took to the television He ordered Khrushchev to remove the missiles. He ordered a quarantine. He sealed off any more advancing Soviet ships from landing and further entrenching Cuba with nuclear missiles. And this was a policy of brinkmanship. Basically, we're on the brink of nuclear war. It's a chicken match between the United States and the Soviet Union, and we're hoping that Khrushchev will not launch one of these missiles. We're trying to seal that island off through a quarantine, and eventually the Soviets will blink, will stop moving in an aggressive way towards Cuba with more missiles, and they will agree to remove missiles. So through diplomacy, this crisis was averted. But for several days, the Cuban Missile Crisis represented great and real fear that the United States could be attacked with an atomic bomb, atomic energy. And so the duck and cover drills, the bomb shelters became even more serious during that time. And then finally, in terms of foes, Vietnam here in Southeast Asia also divided at the 17th parallel in this case. Korea was the 38th parallel. Vietnam's divided at the 17th parallel. This area, north was communist, south was democratic. There was a concern that Ho Chi Minh, who is the leader of the communist-backed north, was going to displace the democratic government in the south. And so for fear of this domino effect, losing South Vietnam, fear that containment would fail in Vietnam and all of Southeast Asia would fall to communism, Kennedy authorized a coup to get rid of the unpopular South Vietnamese leader, and then he instituted the very first military advisors to fight the communist Viet Cong in South Vietnam. All these Viet Cong were being funneled supplies from communist North Korea by trails that led into Laos and Cambodia. It was called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So we're not sure when Kennedy's alive what the next step will be. The U.S. does have military advisors in Vietnam during the Kennedy years. It will fall on Johnson's shoulders after Kennedy's assassination to escalate the conflict. So we'll learn more about that later. Of course, for Kennedy, he will be on a Dallas campaign trip in 1963 in November. He'll be in a parade, campaign parade, in an open car when he'll be assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee Harvey Oswald will kill Kennedy on that day, and that will immediately call the vice president to Dallas to take the oath of office. This is Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, being sworn in on Air Force One, the president's plane. And of course the widow of Kennedy, Jackie Kennedy, still in her blood-stained pink suit from the day's assassination, stands beside the now LBJ being sworn in. So it's a quick transition of power to the new president. As the country is in this Cold War competition, we want to have a seamless transition of power as constitutionally required. The nation's confidence is shaken from the assassination. Everybody watches the funeral on television. Further shaken on the same day that this coverage is taking place, that Oswald himself, who is being transferred between jails, is shot by Jack Ruby. So the assassin of Kennedy shot himself leaves a lot of answers as to conspiracy theories. But the Congress will do an investigation, and ultimately the official report is that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, that it was not a greater communist plot to bring down the government. But certainly having a very popular Kennedy young family killed in office shook the nation's confidence to the core in 1963. In the next video we'll talk about Johnson and his challenges mainly with Vietnam into the 60s.